know. So, you know, you'll have kids, it's amazing, you can have the same parents and everything, but, you know, one child is extremely into everything and just uninhibited completely. You know, never to a stranger, that kind of thing. And the other child, very anxious, not social, doesn't warm up very much socially to folks. It takes, you know, takes a lot of time for that to happen, and very inhibited, you know. So that's the temperament piece. And sometimes mothers can even say, hey, I knew he was going to be hyper in the womb because he was moving all over the place, you know, whereas the other child wasn't. So this is the temperament, and this is probably an inborn thing. And then the personality piece comes in, we think, because this temperament then is shaped by the environment. We just talked about that a little bit. If the environment is, let's say the parents are, there's a whole theory called goodness of fit, where if you have a parent that is very good at dealing with a child that has a bold and uninhibited temperament, you know, then that child, maybe that parent is able to sort of modulate that a little bit, and that child then is able to grow up and not get into lots of trouble and things like that. However, if that child is bold and uninhibited in their temperament, and their environment is not structured at all, let's say, they get away with murder and they continue to all the way through school and everything else, yeah, they may have some trouble with the law, and they may have some issues growing up, you know, as adults. You know, so, again, here we hear it again, you know, the environment is very, very critical here, you know. So so I think, you know, on the other hand, you know, the anxious and inhibited child, the temperament that has, the child that has the temperament of anxious and inhibited, if that child is exposed to an environment where they're never sure where their next meal is going to come from, they're never sure who's going to beat on them next or who's going to hurt them in some way next. You know, they're basically, they look at the world as a scary place. That's going to make them worse. So they're going to have much more of an anxious, you know, adulthood and personality, and maybe even an anxiety disorder of some type. That could be where some of these things come from. So I think it's you kind of have to notice as an adult, you know, when you see kids like this, you know, I think the ideal thing is, well, you don't want to take an anxious child and flood the child with something that's very scary to them, but you should, you know, you can work with them on, you know, trying to be with them, to expose them gradually to other people and things while you're with them, if you're the parent or whatever. You know, and sort of let them kind of come out of their shell a little bit, and nudge them a little, but not so much that it stresses them out. And by the same token, with a bold and uninhibited child, you got to damper them down a little bit so that they don't get away with murder, so to speak. You set some limits and things with them so that they know that there are some limits. So the temperament, you know, I think of the temperament as sort of like handedness, right? We get kind of really used to our temperament. That's sort of one of the things that is unique about us, and we learn how to deal with that and how to deal with the world with that. Sort of like being right-handed, you know. We sort of automatically do certain things with our right hand, and we're dominant in that way. Well, we sort of, with temperaments, we automatically react in a certain way because of our temperament. So we either withdraw if we're anxious and inhibited, or we jump right out there and say, hey, you know, I don't know what this is about, but I'm in, I'm game, you know, that kind of thing. So, you know, it's kind of becomes a piece of who we are and how we automatically deal with things. And I don't think a lot of us really think about that much. That's sort of automatic. It's an unconscious thing. So that's the personality and the temperament. I guess any questions about any of that stuff so far? Talked for quite a while. The next thing is I want to talk just a quick second about the development of the self. You know, how do we conceptualize or see ourselves? You know, that's something interesting. We sort of take that for granted. Animals don't have that ability that we know of. They can't see themselves as a separate, unique, individual person or, you know, animal. We do that, and how do we do that? I guess to take it way back. I mean, when an infant is very young, they don't see themselves as unique and different in any way. They see themselves as the same as mom. They're one and the same as mom, okay? Or dad, or whoever it is that's raising, most of the time it's mom, but somebody that's raising them. They bond with that person, and then that's who they're with. And that's their sense of security. That's their security blanket. So that's where separation anxiety comes from. Because if the mom leaves, it's like a piece of you leaving. And that's what happens to the child. They feel really scared in that situation. Now, how do they, you know, obviously they grow out of that, most kids do, and how does that happen? One of the ways that happens, if you think about it, is we call them transitional objects. But like a blankie, or a pacifier, or a dolly or something, those are like, basically like a little piece of the security from mom that you take with you as a child, and then you're able to go to grandma's and spend the night, or someplace without mom, you know? And that transitional object sort of allows you to sort of segue away from mom, you know, slowly. And then eventually, you know, kids do it all at different ages and all, but they give up the blankie eventually. I know a lot of parents get all worried about that. Oh, he's 10, he still has his blanket, you know. Now, not too many kids not too many people at 25 still have a blanket, so I wouldn't worry that much about it, you know. I mean, kids will get rid of them when they're ready to get rid of them. And, you know, when people say things like, oh, you're too old to have a blanket. Well, who's to say that, you know? I mean, I don't know. That's a judgment call, and every kid's different, and, you know, what's it hurting? I suppose if they took their blanket to work with them and their boss got upset because they were sitting there holding their blanket, you know, that maybe that's interfering with function, and maybe it's time to seek professional help. But I don't know how often that happens. Probably not very often. So anyway, I think it's one thing to keep in mind about, you know, that really it's okay. Those things are okay, and it's really normal development. To be honest, I mean, I'm not sure a lot of people know that, but I think they think it's some kind of weakness or something sometimes, you know. Oh, you don't need that blanket, give that thing up, that kind of thing. I don't know. I mean, just let them be. So, another thing about kids is they tend to think of things very concretely. So if you notice, they can't read between the lines very well. If you give them some expression, let's say, you know, a little cliche or a metaphor or something like that, they can't get it. You know, they take it very literally. You know, I hesitate to say this, kind of gross, but you know, you hear the old expression, "Oh, I stepped on a frog." I don't know if anybody knows what that means, but you know, if you don't know what it means, that's okay. But ask somebody. But you know, if you say that to a child, I've heard of children doing this, where you'll say that to a child, they'll lift up your foot to look and see where the frog is. You know, well, there's no frog there. You know, that's a little inside joke, so we won't go there. I think another thing to keep in mind is that kids they look at things as if they revolve around them in the world. It's called egocentricity, or they're very egocentric. That means if something happens in the environment, it must have had something to do with them. And that's normal too. That's another normal thing about childhood. But in a way, it can hurt them a little, because let's say something bad happens between mom and dad. Let's say they're divorced, or one of the parents dies or something. Because they're very concrete, they can't understand death very well. And so they might think that, mom or dad or whoever died, they left because I wasn't a good enough child, or a pretty enough child, or smart enough, whatever. I didn't behave myself. If only if I had done that, they might be still around and wanted to have stuck around for me. We all know that's not rational, but again, you don't have a lot of rationality when you're a kid. So these are things to kind of keep in mind if you have a younger child and something like that's going on in their lives. Realize that's how they're going to take that. So, kind of help them through that a little bit. Talk through that. Make sure you reinforce with them. It wasn't your fault. Daddy's body was broken, and unfortunately, the doctors couldn't fix it, and a loss like that. Now, this tendency for them to to sort of internalize that stuff, and think that everything that happens has to do with them, that can very much affect self-esteem. Because if you can imagine, if you feel like dad left you because you weren't good enough, as an adult, you're going to grow in, you're going to not maybe feel so good about yourself. You're always going to kind of grow up with this sort of lingering feeling. Maybe it's unconscious, but some lingering feeling that maybe I'm not good enough, or I'm not, so it can affect your self-esteem. And ultimately, when your self-esteem isn't very good, you can end up with trouble with depression. So it's definitely stuff, things to keep in mind. Speaking of self-esteem, where does that come from? And I think, we all sort of know this. I hope all of us know this, but I'm going to say it anyway, just in case. There may be some folks that don't. But the child, parents and teachers and the folks that are around the child as it's growing, as the child is growing up and developing, they're the people that shape that child's brain into what it's going to become. Okay, and that goes for self-esteem too. So, example. If you have a little boy and you constantly berate him and tell him nothing's ever good enough, you can't do anything right, that kind of thing. You're irritated with him all the time. Well, how do you think he's going to feel about himself growing up? I mean, it's not going to be very good, is it? He's going to always think that nothing's ever good enough. He's always going to feel like nothing I can do in Dad's eyes is good enough. And that's going to give him a a bit of a chip on his shoulder and feel pretty bad about himself, and self-esteem is going to be poor, and then set him up for trouble with depression as a child or as an adult. So instead of being